Awesome. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris, and this is Johnny. And as Niall said, we met here last year, and I was doing a talk about climate action and the environmental footprint of adventures. And Johnny came up to me afterwards, and we had a really good chat. And then over the past 12 months, we've been continuing that conversation. And part of what we're going to share today has emerged from those conversations. So I'll hand back over to Johnny to kick us off, and then we'll get to that later.
Thanks, Chris. So Shane was really excited for us to speak today about giving people the agency for change. So how do we as individuals, how do we as little old me do something powerful amongst these global challenges that we're facing, many of which we've talked about this weekend so far? And so we're going to start with this idea of a polycrisis. Hands up if you've heard this term before. Okay, a few people. So essentially, a polycrisis is this idea that we have currently around the world multiple interconnected global crises. So environmental crises, climate change, biodiversity collapse, economic, geopolitical, and social collapse. And these are really causing a lot of complexity and a lot of systemic issues around the world. And it's hard to realize how we're going to navigate that uncertainty that this polycrisis is causing. And they're multidimensional. And they're showing up in our lives in unique different ways. So the polycrisis is present in our organizations in different ways. It's present in our communities, in our regions, in our sectors. And the World Economic Forum, they did a really interesting piece of work around this landscape. So what are some of the crises that we're experiencing? And how are they showing up? And what is their prevalence? And so it allows us to think how we really are finding ourselves stuck. For example, the cost of living crisis. How does that relate to climate change? And how does that relate to biodiversity collapse? So that's what we're really going to explore today, and why we believe that this is a real call for systemic action and for thinking in systems and not linear thinking that has got us into this mess.
Awesome. Thanks, Johnny. So how do we rise to those challenges? How can we collectively and collaboratively rise to the climate challenge or the polycrisis, as Johnny mentioned? Something we're really passionate about, and is a pathway forwards for us to do that, is systems thinking, or systems leadership and systems change. But what does that mean, and what does that look like? So simply put, Donella Meadows is one of the pioneers of systems thinking. And simply put, systems thinking is the ability to seek the whole system view and have that holistic approach to the challenges that we face. Taking that a step further, Anna Burney from Forum for the Future, who are based here in London, she talks about a living systems approach. How do we recognize and acknowledge the systems in nature, and how can we bring those into our work? So let's unpick that a little bit with a little bit of an example. So again, hands up, how many people have heard of the UN Sustainable Development Goals? So most of us. So we often see the goals depicted like this: 17 goals to be achieved by 2030 in colorful boxes. But what happens if we view them like this? More interconnected, so the 17 goals are still represented, but they're shown in a different way. And building upon this further, what happens if we view them like this, as an interconnected web, showing the interconnections and relationships between the goals, and ensuring that if we take action in one part of the system, for example, one of the goals here, that it doesn't compromise another part of the system. So this is a really simple example of systems thinking, thinking holistically, and ensuring that we embed that approach into our work. The example that I like to give is a perfect metaphor from nature, is a murmuration of starlings. I live on the west coast of Wales, lucky enough to see this every day throughout the winter. And how can we do the same? How can we flow together so we can move in the right direction? But why is this important? For us, it's important to deliver systems change or systems transformation. And just to touch on that briefly, And what we mean by that, you may have heard of incremental change, which is sometimes described as first-order change, or doing things better. But moving forwards, we have second-order change, which is doing better things. And for us, it's about transformation, systems transformation. Third-order change in seeing things differently. And that's what we're passionate about in terms of facilitating that approach and embedding that within what we do. Because for me, when we change the way we look at things, the things we look at change. And I'll hand back over to Johnny to bring that to life even further for a real-world application for a conservation example.
Thanks, Chris. So over the last few years, I've been working with this group called Bounce Beyond, and our work is really based in this context of transformative change. So when we look at a sector, or an industry, or an organization, how do we move beyond this idea of incremental change? How do we move into this space of fundamentally shifting the power, the values, the mindsets, the worldviews in this space? And there's an example I'm going to share today with some work that we've done with the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy are a huge global conservation NGO, and they work in various terrestrial, marine, freshwater areas. And we've been working with their Latin America group in a region called the Selva Maya and the Mesoamerican Reef. And the Nature Conservancy, they have their own set of 2030 goals. And they are feeling that in many of their iconic places, they're falling short on these 2030 goals. Many of those reasons are because they're a very traditional conservation organization. They're very much owning up to the fact that they have a colonial history of buying land and putting a fence around it and calling that conservation, but realizing that to really foster powerful transformative change, they need systems change in these regions. And so the Selva Maya is this area of incredible cultural diversity, ranging from the Mayan civilization to now they have around 1.7 million indigenous peoples living in the area. It's a region with incredible diversity. There's 5 big cat species, for example, lots of other rare species, Nile's beloved tapir. The Mesoamerican Reef is the second largest barrier reef in the world. Again, a huge array of diversity. It's the largest gathering of whale sharks in the world. But they're facing issues, they're facing problems in these areas, not too dissimilar from other issues that we've discussed this weekend. Deforestation, both legal and illegal, environmental degradation, social unrest, and the fact that TNC are working in this space across 3 nations who have very different politics, very different ways of governing. And so Bounce Beyond used as an entry point to this systems change work a tool called the 3 Horizons model. And Chris and I have been sort of showcasing this over the course of the weekend. But very simply, the first horizon is this idea of the current system. What current dynamics are we experiencing? What are the patterns? What are the relationships? How are we stuck? What are we doing well that we want to hold on to in the context of the Selva Maya and Mesoamerican Reef? The third horizon is this vision of a flourishing future. How do we co-create that? Where do we want to get to? Who do we need in the room with us to co-create that vision? And the second horizon is this transformative space, that transformative pathway that's going to take us from the first horizon to the third horizon. And this is the really exciting bit. I'm just going to briefly run through our findings from the first horizon and the third horizon that were co-created. And I'm just going to say as well that this was all data that was brought out from this region. And the Nature Conservancy, they were very intentional about who they were looking to get this information from in terms of the indigenous peoples, the local communities, and so on. And in Horizon 1, it may be no surprise to you, the current system, they're experiencing unsustainable markets and practices, ever-growing environmental and societal crises. And as well, like this, behind this data is piles and piles of maps, and like us system thinkers, we get very excited about maps, but I won't bore you with that now. Horizon 3, we have continuously evolving human nature well-being. So a mindset driving stewardship of the conservation of nature. So this is their flourishing future that they want to get to, that North Star. I said I wasn't going to share a map with you, but I actually am. I apologize. Because the Horizon 2 space, I'm not expecting you to take this in, but I want to use this as an example to run through the kind of work that we do. So this is their transformative space. How do we actually implement systems change in such a diverse and important region? And we found at the center of this was developing transformational action. But I'm going to pick up a few of these elements, like developing an ecosystem approach to conservation was really important, so away from their linear approach to traditional conservation. Empowering and legitimizing communities to drive conservation, sponsoring pathways for human well-being, and so on. And behind each of these blocks, again, is piles and piles of data. But what's really interesting about this is that we can then hone into individual aspects of these pieces and treat them as subsystems. So then when we have these subsystems as area of focus, we then ask the question again, who do we need at the table to be able to explore this issue powerfully? And then all of these individual areas of focus are still being held within that holistic systems change strategy. So this is a way of us seeing individually. If I have my own individual skills and talents, or if I'm working in a sector that I'm working on one of these, for example, that is specific to the place I'm working in, if I actually start working with those stakeholders and people who I may not usually be speaking to and collaborating with, we can start to implement real change. And we love this quote by Buckminster Fuller: to change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So I'm going to ask you to think about what's your Horizon 1 in your areas or your organization or your communities? What's your Horizon 3? How do you paint that picture of that flourishing future that you want to aim towards? And then that Horizon 2, what are those powerful transformative initiatives that you need to start? Maybe build up, give further capacity towards. But try and picture for yourselves that systems change journey. And back to Chris to explore what we've been working on since last year.
Nice one. Thanks, Johnny. So flowing back to where we are today, as mentioned, me and Johnny met here last year, and over the past 12 months, we've been trying to create the conditions for a new initiative to emerge, and that we've come up with is Venture Shift, and we're the co-initiators of that. And we're trying to take this approach that Johnny's outlined and apply it to the outdoor industry to facilitate this systems change or transformational approach to deliver that positive impact for people and planet. And we're starting out on that journey and have identified a number of key categories or parts of the system, which are on the screen now. And I'd be curious to know whether any of you feel like you fall within those categories. Maybe a show of hands if you think you're a storyteller or a communicator, or within the educational space, or expeditions, experiences, and. And I think some of you are, or a lot of you maybe are. And our approach is trying to identify those parts of the system and seeking that whole system view to enable them not to look like this, but to instead look like this, so we can facilitate that co-creation and co-imagination of a more flourishing future. And how can we do that across this industry? And as mentioned, we're really excited about the possibility of co-facilitating and enabling that to emerge. And we know that's a challenge, but my provocation or invitation to you is, if you're up for that challenge and can see how you may fall within this or anything that we've shared today, that we'd really love to chat with you and explore that further. We're very passionate about thinking big. There's a quote from Michelangelo was quoted as saying, our greatest danger isn't that we aim too high and we don't reach it, but our greatest danger is that we aim too low and we achieve it. So how can we think big? How can we be radical in our approaches, but have this systems thinking approach? This event is called Explore, and we're up for that exploration and adventure, and we'd love to invite you to join us if you can see yourself falling within that. And for us, true exploration is about moving beyond our egos. We're not about getting the quickest or the fastest or the highest. But for us, it's about leading from a place of love and compassion. So I encourage you to reflect upon that and think about our approach we've identified here today and how we can be systems thinkers, and more importantly, how we can be compassionate and collaborative leaders to rise to the challenges we face, because that's what the challenge ahead of us needs, and that's what our children will remember. So how can we facilitate that flourishing and thriving future? We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to exploring more.